Imagine you are a Spanish conquistador, sailing with a fleet still celebrating their great victory over the English. When you finally reach your destination, you're greeted by katana-wielding warriors and pirate mercenaries. These are your allies who will help you conquer an empire. As the 16th century comes to an end, you are participating in the audacious plan to conquer China. But can you do it? Or are you setting in motion world-changing events that will upend the entire course of history? Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian. Let's talk about the time Spain almost conquered China. Often referred to as the Empresa de China, or China Enterprise, or China Project, this was a proposed conquest of some or all of China by Spain in the later half of the 16th century. Now, just saying this makes the China Enterprise sound batshit crazy, but when you start digging into it more, it comes off like the regular kind of crazy, which is where things get really interesting. Now, the plan came about during a time when things were going great for Spain. They were a major world power with vast amounts of gold and silver flowing in from their conquests in the Americas. As part of the Holy League, Spain won a major naval victory against the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. Furthermore, following the War of Portuguese Succession, Spain and Portugal would be united under a single monarch from 1580 to 1640. And most importantly, for the purposes of this video, Spain had a new colony in a group of islands that would become known as the Philippines. Now, at first, the Spanish found the Philippines disappointing because it lacked large amounts of gold, silver, or other valuable goods. However, the Spanish would soon learn the colony was extremely useful for trade with China. Indeed, the Spanish town of Manila became a major hub between Spanish and Chinese merchants. Chinese goods like silk and porcelain would flow into the colony in exchange for Spanish silver mined from Peru. That was in huge demand at the time in China. For some, this might have been enough, but the Spanish colonizers of the Philippines wanted to be conquistadors, not merchants, and so started to covet China itself. Because why trade for silk or porcelain when you can just take it? With the support of many Jesuit priests who wanted to spread Christianity into a country they were banned from, the Spanish colonizers of the Philippines attempted to convince King Philip II of Spain that the Philippines could be used as a base for launching an invasion of China. It was argued that China was ripe for conquest, and optimistically suggested that with only a small army and help from local allies, like the Japanese, who the Jesuits were active among, it could be taken easily. As the 16th century wore on, the plan became more complex as the Spanish received better intelligence about China. The plan called for an army of tens of thousands of Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, Filipino, Chinese, and Indian soldiers gathered from across both the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Massive bribes were also planned in order to buy the loyalty of local Chinese officials. This army, after securing control of certain Chinese coastal provinces, would then march on Beijing, where the Spanish would set themselves up as rulers, but keep the Chinese bureaucracy in place in order to maintain control over the populace. Once conquered, the Jesuits would work to convert the populace to Christianity by building churches, monasteries, and universities. The Spanish also hoped their policy of intermarriage would create a culture of mixed-race Chinese and Spaniards who would be loyal subjects of the empire. And with China under their control, they could continue to expand outward, as seen in this map. First, China's neighbors would be brought into the Spanish imperial fold, until ultimately Spain would be opening a new front against the Ottoman Empire on their eastern flank. And the thing is, the China Enterprise was more than just mere talk. By the 1580s, the Spanish in the Philippines got pretty far in their preparations. Budgets were drawn up, new towns and fortifications were built in the Philippines, weapons and supplies were gathered, and deals were made with Christian Japanese and Chinese pirates to send troops for the coming campaign. All they needed was the go-ahead of King Philip II. But that never came. You see, while the Spanish colonizers in the Philippines were gung-ho about invading China, no one else in the Spanish Empire was that excited for it. Many Catholic religious orders, including other Jesuits, didn't think a war of conquest would spread Christianity to China. The Portuguese were also worried this plan would hurt their interests in the region by disrupting trade. Most importantly, King Philip II didn't see the reason why you should start a war with China on the other side of the world when Spain was already fighting the Dutch and English closer to home. Ultimately, the failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588 ended the China Enterprise, as Spain wasn't about to risk another such defeat. Spain did try invading Cambodia in 1593, but that turned out to be a complete failure. But in all honesty, could Spain really conquer China at this time? The China enterprise was ambitious to say the least, but many think it was unlikely to succeed. For one thing, China was not the Aztecs or the Incas. China was technologically on par with Europeans, had a population and economy much greater than Spain, had experience with Old World diseases, and was located much farther away from the core Spanish territories. That last bit was especially important because of the time it took for messages to travel to Spain from the Philippines and back again. Even if King Philip II gave them the go-ahead, the conquistadors would be on their own, as reinforcements would not be forthcoming. I also wouldn't be surprised if the projected costs and manpower necessary to actually conquer China were grossly underestimated. Much of the intelligence Spain had on China often came from people who never actually visited it, or else only spent very limited time in the country. So yeah, the China enterprise planners weren't getting the best intelligence. But we alternate historians are benefited with the power of hindsight, so we know a few things these would-be conquistadors didn't. We know, for example, that the Ming dynasty was already in a state of decline around the late 16th century and would collapse in 1644. And while the Chinese had the edge in manpower, their military at the time was small, spread out across a large area, and poorly led. Officers were often corrupt and stole money and supplies from their soldiers. The soldiers themselves also had a tendency to desert. Thus, China, while perhaps capable of dealing with the occasional peasant revolt or pirate menace, may not have been ready to face an organized and determined invader. Indeed, that sort of happened in our timeline during the Imjin War from 1592 to 1598. Japan invaded Korea with the intent of ultimately conquering China. However, thanks to the determined resistance of the Koreas, it bought enough time for China to gather reinforcements to come to their aid. While the Japanese were ultimately defeated, the conflict was still a drain on China and likely contributed to the eventual fall of the Ming dynasty. So what if someone just skipped Korea and went straight for China itself? Look, the China enterprise is still a long shot, but not necessarily an impossible one. Just as long as the Spanish set some more realistic goals and have a lot of luck on their side, they might actually pull it off. So, assuming things are stable enough in Europe, or else everyone is high off a victory by the Spanish Armada, which honestly could be a whole video in itself, King Philip II gives the go-ahead to invade China. So, sometime around 1590-ish, a Spanish-led multinational army lands in the Chinese provinces of Fujian and Guangdong. The Chinese, caught completely off guard and perhaps also distracted by diversionary Japanese attacks in Korea, are unable to drive off the conquistadors. The conquistadors then march toward Beijing, beating off hastily assembled armies before finally reaching the capital. At this point, the conquistadors are exhausted, but manage to project just enough of an aura of strength that the Chinese decide to deal rather than keep fighting. The resulting peace is humiliating for China, even though it's less than what the China enterprise plotters originally desired. Several coastal provinces are ceded directly to the Spanish, Korea is abandoned to the Japanese, a Spanish official is assigned to Beijing to keep an eye on the emperor, Jesuits are given free rein across China, and Spanish merchants now have a monopoly over Chinese trade. So what happens next? Well, Spain would need to appoint a whole slew of government officials, nobles, and bishops in their new Chinese territories. Plus, the Habsburgs would get to add some new titles to their already long list. Spanish immigration to the region would also be encouraged to help offset the imbalance of Chinese people versus Spanish colonists. Many of these colonizers would take Chinese wives in conjunction with the Spanish policy of encouraging new arrivals to marry local women, creating a group of people similar to the Chinese mestizos community that emerged in the Philippines during the Spanish colonial period. The Jesuits would get to work preaching Christianity, while other religious orders would rush to get a presence in the region as well. As for future conquests, I think the Spanish may still try for and be more successful in seizing Cambodia, but they may also try to colonize what is today called Taiwan. In our timeline, Spain did establish a small colony there called Spanish Formosa in 1626 to protect its trade in the region, but the colony didn't last long due to a lack of interest by Spain. But in this alternate timeline, where Spain has territory in China to defend, I could see a more serious attempt to control the island. So, for a decade or two at least, the China enterprise seems like a complete success. As for China, I don't think the Ming dynasty will last much longer after this. Their defeat to the Spanish only hastens their decline, and eventually much of the country is in revolt. In the short term, this is great for the Spanish as it means their coastal provinces aren't under direct threat from a united Chinese state. But unless the Spanish are willing to prop up the Ming or else commit to further conquests, another faction might take control of China. So as Spain proper is distracted by a war in Europe, the Manchu Qing dynasty of our timeline, or some alternate dynasty, might seize control of China and seek revenge against the Spanish. As mentioned earlier, the Spanish and China would lack the manpower to fight the Chinese in a long drawn-out war, and given the distances involved, Spain would be unlikely to reinforce them in a timely manner. Thus, the revitalized Chinese could easily drive the Spanish into the sea. Indeed, they may even be assisted by the Portuguese, who in our timeline also chafed under Spanish rule, and in 1640 began a long fight for their independence. But would they stop there? This alternate China would have experienced firsthand the threat of European imperialism and would have the resources to expand outward. China could build the fleets necessary to seize Taiwan, sack Manila, drive Japan out of Korea, and perhaps even take out a shogun. Spain would have to decide whether to commit the soldiers, materials, and money necessary for long campaigns in East Asia, or save them for fights in Europe and the Americas, and frankly, they probably will choose the latter. And if they do, I don't think there is much to stop this much more outward-facing China that is highly motivated to avoid being humiliated by Europeans again. Chinese fleets could sail across the Pacific and Indian Ocean to challenge Europeans poking around these areas. A Chinese naval base may be built in Pearl Harbor, while Chinese armies could push their borders into Central Asia and Siberia in defiance of Russia's push eastward. Ultimately, this may lead to China becoming just another imperialist colonizer, which wouldn't be great for the people they colonized, but what's funny is that map I showed you earlier might come true, just not the way Spain ultimately intended. Okay, I think it's finally time to wrap this thing up. The Empresa de China fascinates me in ways that are hard to describe. I mean, you should all know me by now. I'm not exactly a fan of colonialism or imperialism, but the audacity and reckless optimism of these would-be conquistadors is, frankly, astounding. And the weird thing is, if just a couple more things went in their favor, they might have actually conquered China, if only for a short time. If there is any lesson to be learned here, especially for people who aren't imperialist colonizers, it's that if you really want to do something, even if it seems to be impossible, you should try to do it. Better to try and fail than do nothing and be left for the rest of your life asking, what if? Well, that's all I have to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, click that bell icon, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.